So what are some examples of how transformative mediation is used?
Well, that's a good question, because a lot of times it helps to have some concrete examples to understand what does this mean that there are shifts that occur or changes that occur that somehow the mediation process helps with. One of the areas where this model, this approach to mediation is used is in workplace conflicts. And the U.S. Postal Service, remember going postal? We don't hear so much about it anymore. And part of the reason for that is that for the last 10 years or so, they've been using transformative mediation all over the country to address conflicts between workers and managers in the workplace. They've mediated over 100,000 cases using this process in different places. One of the examples of that, which is actually included in our first book, The Promise of Mediation, is about a conflict between a postal worker, a letter carrier, and his supervisors, because he wants to be trained to become a supervisor, and they don't want to train him. The reason they don't want to, and well, we don't have to get in. The story unfolds. Actually, the story of the mediation is told in the introduction to our book, and as the mediation unfolds, the letter carrier basically explains why he sees himself as a kind of advisor to other letter carriers. He knows a lot about the workplace, and he helps people in the workplace, and that's why he's thinking to become a supervisor. And he talks that through, and the mediator helps him to express all that without sort of controlling what he's saying, and it just helps him to express himself, gives him the room to do that. When the supervisors respond, and then the worker says, and you refuse to train me to become a supervisor, and I don't understand why, and that's why I filed this complaint. So the supervisors then respond to him, again, without a lot of control by the mediator. The supervisor tells him, you know what? When you asked about training, this is what the worker says, I'm sorry. When I asked about training, you told me I will never, ever, under any circumstances, train you to do anything. So that's a pretty big rejection. And that's when the guy filed the complaint. So then the supervisor begins talking in response and explains that although the worker thinks that he's very helpful to his fellow workers, the fact of the matter is he is, in effect, a jailhouse lawyer. He's creating problems for the management by offering lots of advice and encouraging people to file complaints. And what makes him think that the supervisors want to train him to be a supervisor when he just makes their work more difficult? Now, again, we're not talking, all right, is that right or wrong? This is the conversation that they want to have. So the supervisor actually gets pretty upset about this and expresses that and is allowed to do that by the openness of the transformative mediation process. So he says, what makes you think I would extend myself to provide informal training to someone who has years spent trying to make everything I do harder by being a jailhouse lawyer? I want you to know that being a supervisor means taking what I do seriously and wanting to do more of the kind of thing I do. So the supervisor is essentially saying, I don't think you get what I do. You say you want to do it, but you don't get what it is. So then they start having a meaningful conversation about what that is. And the employee, instead of being resentful, sits back and starts listening to what the supervisor is saying. That's a shift. That's a change. That's a change which means I'm feeling stronger and able to listen to what you have to say, and I'm realizing that you do have something to say. You're not just the guy who's denying me this job. You are somebody who is actually interested in what I have to say, and now you're responding. So they continue to have that conversation, and because they are now talking to each other and listening to each other in a different way, they're expressing themselves more fully and completely and calmly, and they're listening more openly to each other, the whole conversation starts to shift. And eventually, the supervisor says, look, I want you to apply for formal training. He says, don't worry about being accepted. Nobody's accepted the first time. That's what you didn't understand before. But just putting together the application and completing it means that you're taking it seriously. I want to see you do that. I want to see you do that. So now the employee has a totally different understanding of what's going on, and he is really willing to sort of move forward on this basis. So he turns back to the supervisor and says, okay, I get it. And you know what? I'm going to drop my complaint. Which, of course, was a big threat to the people think that filing a complaint, that's the employee's thing. The supervisors are impervious. When a supervisor has a complaint filed against him, that's a black mark on his record. It's actually a real threat to the supervisor. So the supervisors are very pleased with this, and in the end they say, you know what, you did the right thing. And then the supervisor says, the way the mediator actually wrote the description of this case, the mediator who did it, he says, the supervisor then said, his voice full of emotion, "It'll be a privilege to train you," and then laughed and said, "and fun too, because I'm going to watch you start seeing the world the way I do." Now, you could say that case achieved a settlement. It surely did. That claim could have gone on to a formal hearing. It could have gone on to a lawsuit. The actual rate of formal complaint filings and lawsuits in the Postal Service has dropped dramatically since they started using this process. So, of course, has the incidence of quote-unquote going postal. This process has helped people in the workplace to talk through conflict in a way that they really didn't have the opportunity to do before. And it's made a big difference in the workplace. That's not just resolving a conflict, resolving a case. That's changing the way that those two people are seeing themselves and each other and treating themselves and each other in a very difficult situation. And it carries forward in the workplace. Those two people are going to go back to the workplace with a different sense of their own competency and their own sense of mutual understanding. And the workplace as a whole will be affected by that. That's why the Postal Service actually adopted this model. They adopted it because they believed it would increase productivity overall in the workplace if employees and supervisors had this opportunity to engage in conversations about conflict in this way. So that's a little example of how this works in practice.